My name is Mark Niccolò. I'm in the Department of Politics and History here at Brunel, colleague of Filippo's in the Social and Political Thought Research Group. We have two speakers coming. First is Alison Brown, and then followed by Peter Stacey. Alison is Emeritus Professor of Italian Renaissance History at Royal Holloway, not very far from here, just down the road. Her research, as you probably know, focuses on classical heritage in the Renaissance, and in particular, Lucretius and Florentine political culture. Among her publications is The Return of Lucretius to Renaissance Florence from 2 or 3 years ago, and a book on the interplay of politics, humanism, and religion in Florence. Alison, over to you.
Good. Can you hear me? Is it all right? Well, in talking about Lucretius and Machiavelli today, I can no longer claim to be following an untrodden path. Proust and even pre-Greenblatt, the path is now pounded by the force of many feet. Multa pulsata pedum, to use Lucretius's own expression. And many scholars, including many here today, have been gathering the Lucretian flowers that are scattered among so many Renaissance writings. Nevertheless, it seems to me that the extent of Lucretius's Lucretius's impact on Machiavelli's modernism hasn't been fully demonstrated. To judge, at least from one recent comment, that the reason for Lucretius's neglect over so many years was due to his unimportance, not his importance in needing to be suppressed. Far from being unimportant, Lucretius's atomism and faltering anticipation of Darwinism make the Lucretians today's winners by proxy, as David Sedley has put it. By presenting you with a series of comparisons, I want to illustrate how much Machiavelli's most innovative thinking owed to these ideas, and especially to the naturalistic and expedient morality that developed from them. To do that, I shall be talking mostly about his account of early man and the growth of justice and religion. But before that, and especially in view of the problem that we still face in reconciling Machiavelli's inconsistencies, especially his apparent belief in astral determinism and his belief in freedom, a few words on the wider context of his debt to Lucretius and the Epicureans, who, it seems to me, combined necessity and freedom rather differently from all the other ancient and Christian writers. As we all know, the Epicurean world was neither divine nor providential, as it was for the Platonists and Christians, according to whom it was created by a foresighted God, who offered freedom through redemption in the afterlife, and for the Platonists, of course, by metempsychosis. Nor was it purposeful, as it was for the Aristotelians, according to whom nature did nothing in vain and worked towards a final end, or telos. Instead, the Epicurean world was one of many mortal worlds, created in an eternal universe by chance and dying with no possibility of an afterlife for its inhabitants. Thanks to the swerve, this world escapes rigid determinism, the decrees of fate, and allows us freedom to go wherever our mind has taken us. Yet, because in time our world developed regular cycles of development, according to necessary laws of cause and effects, what Lucretius calls foedera naturae, it was possible for Epicurus to explain that, quoting him now, some things happen of necessity, others by chance, others through our own agency. What I would call a tripart division of forces in the world that has interesting repercussions in Machiavelli, or perhaps resonance would be a better word, resonance in Machiavelli. Moreover, thanks to these foedera, or laws of nature, creatures retain as inherited genes or traits the qualities that ensured their initial survival. So, lions and foxes retain their initial ferocity and guile. And although humans acquired additional polish through education, as Lucretius puts it, doctrina politos constituat, humans too retain the original traces of these animal passions, including fear, that remain intermingled with reason in the psyche. Unlike in Plato and Aristotle's psyche, which is totally rational, and they remain important for survival and independence. I stress all this because these are the ideas that also dominate Machiavelli's world, in which affairs are governed by the same mixture of continuity, or necessity, flux, change, and individual freedom, or self-agency. First of the building blocks, then, is an unchanging universe. A universe that is unchanging. Lucretius, eadem sunt omnia semper. Everything is always the same. Machiavelli, the world has been always in the same condition, and following exactly the same rhythm. Lucretius, atoms will behave now as they did in the past and will in the future. And so will people, says Machiavelli, since they have the same passions now as in the past and will have in the future. And it is, and always has been, and always will be, that evil follows after good and good after evil. Secondly, then, continual motion and cyclical change. Within this ever-changing universe of space and atoms, there is nevertheless constant movement. Lucretius, sempre in assiduo moto, always in continual motion. Machiavelli, sempre in moto. And as the atoms jostle each other, they diminish where they have left and increase where they arrive, fading and flourishing in repetitive cycles of change, as Lucretius describes, or as Machiavelli puts it, descending and rising, moving from good to bad and back again. The third element is the swerve, which, according to Lucretius, causes the free will, and the word is libera voluntas, of living creatures all over the earth to go where pleasure leads them. Progredimus quo ducit quemquem voluptas, swerving our motions just where our mind has taken us. But instead of encouraging the fatalism and astral determinism that Anthony Parel finds in Machiavelli, misreading both his early letter to Bartolomeo Vespucci and his musings or Ghiribizzi to Gian Battista Soderini, Machiavelli believed that each man should do what his mind prompts him to, and do it with daring, as he wrote in a revealing addition to his Ghiribizzi. As you know, the additions are put in the margin of his draft, and their editors have put them in rather different places in the text, but they are very interesting afterthoughts on his rather more determinist original writing. Changing himself, or as he later put it in The Prince, exercising our free will in the half of life left to us by fortune. It's equally clear that this fortune has nothing to do with the moral freedom of Christians to choose between good and evil, as scholars like Carrie Nederman suggest. Not only did Machiavelli apparently reject the idea of individual souls, translating anima as imagination rather than as soul or spirit. Reading him through the lens of Lucretius, it also seems clear that freedom meant for him free volition, or as he put it in the marginal summary of De Rerum Natura, Book 2, lines 250 to 255, which I quote here. And this is manuscript Vaticano Rossi 884, which is Machiavelli's transcription of Lucretius, thanks to which, incidentally, we know he was influenced by Lucretius, because otherwise he never refers to him. Motrum varium esse, et ex eo nos libram haberi mentem. From motion there is variety, and from it we have free will. This is a summary, rather than his own free comment of what Lucretius was writing, but I think it's very notable that I haven't found it anywhere else. It's his own particular summary, only in Book 2, and it, I think, does point to the part of the book that he was particularly interested in. This meant in practice that a wise and energetic man could change step and think outside the box, as I think we'd say it today. Moreover, Machiavelli evidently shared Lucretius's belief that this mental freedom was a natural attribute of all living creatures, that is, animals as well as men, as we'll see by turning to his hard primitivist account of early man. According to Lucretius, men lived scattered like wild animals roaming at large at the beginning of the world, which is also how Machiavelli describes early man, when there were few inhabitants in the world. At this early stage of man's development, men lived in woods and caves, just as Bartolomeo Scala describes them in his consolation to Cosimo de' Medici on the death of his son in 1463. And this is one of the very earliest texts to quote directly from and be influenced by De Rerum Natura after its discovery by Poggio. It had been copied, of course, by Niccolò, but Niccolò kept it with him. Then people gradually got to know it in the papal courier, but this Scala and Ficino were the first people to actually quote chunks of it in their writings. Before that, it hadn't been quoted. And here, just as an aide-memoir, the paintings by Piero di Cosimo, based on, as Ernst Panofsky told us long ago in 1939, that they were based on Lucretius and the Epicureans. So on the top we have Piero di Cosimo's painting of the forest fire, which is in the Ashmolean in Oxford, where you see animals ranging around the forest just at the point when the forest is beginning to burn, which is the beginning of civilization. And then below that, the hunt and the return from the hunt from the Met in New York. And notice in the hunt that the animals and men are fighting each other as equals, and in the return from the hunt, the men are basically victorious. They've conquered the animals, and they're then in the next process of going to domesticate them. In this early stage of life before there were laws, life ante legem. It was only the fittest who survived, as Lucretius describes in these lines, which were quoted by Marcello Adriani. Adriani succeeded Poliziano as the lecturer of poetry and oratory in the Florentine studio in 1494. And then he gave these inaugural lectures at the beginning of each academic year, beginning in November. So they were held in public for parents and the students. And it's important I stress this because it's a great way of Lucretius's ideas and writings getting known before quite a wide audience in Florence every year. Well, this one was delivered in 1495, a year after the French invasion and departure of the elder Medici branch. And he quoted in his lecture, "They had no concept of the common good, knew no customs, used no laws. Each man bore off the booty that fortune gave him, learning to survive and live off his own bat." Self-survival was, in fact, the cry of the city. Time seems to have gone. As we can see from the Florentines quoted here. That's Roberto Acciaioli and Piero Alamanni, supporting the idea, Lucretius's idea, that only the fittest survived, and that early man's objective in banding together was self-defense and not Ciceronian self-improvement. And still following the development of early man from Piero di Cosimo's paintings. Switch this on. It's gone off, I think.
There's some interference, which is they're trying to adjust it.
Oh, they're trying to adjust it.
But I think it's making it worse. Yeah.
Still following the development of early man from Piero di Cosimo's paintings, we can see the next stage, and here I show you from the National Gallery in Ottawa, still Piero di Cosimo. Men got themselves huts and skins and fire. They mated, had children, and then, for the first time, the human race began to grow soft. Molescere coipit. Here we see Vulcan hammering metal thanks to the discovery of fire, wives and children, the building of houses and domestication of animals. This in turn led to the need for protection or self-defense by forming mutual compacts, or as Machiavelli interprets it, by agreeing to select a strong man to defend them, telescoping what in Lucretius and Epicurus are two stages. The first stage is mutual agreements, covenants, or foedera, not to be harmed or not to harm or be harmed by others, as Epicurus and Lucretius both describe. Nec laedant, nec laedantur. This, of course, is the earliest moral teaching, or the Golden Rule, taught by Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, as well as by Epicureans, and then, of course, by Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, as Scala reminds us in his dialogue on the laws and legal judgments, by Muslims, and finally by Thomas Hobbes, as we see here. In Machiavelli, this reciprocal rule is reflected in the feelings of hatred and sympathy that we feel at the sight of someone injuring our benefactor, well aware that we might suffer the same injuries. It's only after the second stage that we can talk about justice, defined by laws that are made effective by punishment, the aspect of natural law which is most Machiavellian, to which he rapidly jumps by saying that after these feelings of hatred and sympathy, men then began to make laws, order punishments for those who broke them, whence came the notion of justice. Although very summary, Machiavelli's account of justice adapts the key features of Epicurean justice that make it distinctive, in that it's expedient, it's not absolute, nor is it universal, like Aristotle's natural law. Instead, it's based by agreement by particular communities and made effective by laws and punishment. Lucretius's analysis of the psychology of fear strikes a very modern note in us post-Freudians today, especially since he applies it not only to religion, but also to the hidden fear of punishment, the metus poenarum, that assails wrongdoers even when asleep, in a marvelous passage in Lucretius where he describes this. This fear of punishment was, for Machiavelli, the greatest lord, signore, there is. And in The Prince, he wrote that fear is sustained by a dread of punishment that never leaves us. Fear of God's punishment, or vindictiveness, is equally powerful, according to Lucretius, since it makes people fill their cities with altars and performances of sacred rites to propitiate God's wrath. Here we see Adriani in his Lucretian inaugural lecture, 1497, Nil admirari, fear nothing, comes from Horace, but in fact Horace is using Lucretius here. The lecture is all about Lucretius and religion. So in this lecture, Fear Nothing, he urges people not to be frightened by this superstitious view of God as a pawnbroker, in making people wait a long time to settle their debts at the Last Judgment in order to gain more interest or indulgences from them in the time until then. Since Marcello Adriani says God's not like that, he's a healer, not a pawnbroker. Machiavelli was equally aware of God's power and its utility to rulers as a political weapon. So we find that both Scala and Machiavelli, long before David Hume, point out how lawgivers claimed their laws came from God in order to get them accepted. Scala citing Moses, familiar to us all this morning, as someone who did this, and Machiavelli quoting Savonarola. We can see from this how much Lucretius contributed to Machiavelli's transgressivism, which rejected Christian providentialism and the teleology of classical philosophers in favor of naturalistic or prudential justice and religion. In much the same way that that's Machiavelli and Lucretius, argued that language, like law and justice, were not based on pre-existing norms, but were developed spontaneously for their practical utility. Language, incidentally, is another Epicurean topic in Machiavelli, which I've discussed on another occasion, and I haven't time to talk about it here, but I think it is another area in which we can see this Lucretian influencing Machiavelli. Machiavelli's cycle of change was slightly different from Lucretius's, more Polybian, and post-Pedulla, we should perhaps say, more more Dionysius of Halicarnassian. Nevertheless, what the two men, Lucretius and Machiavelli, share in common is their emphasis on the role played by ambition in corrupting primitive naturalism, both describing the Sisyphean task of rolling rocks up a mountain as they vainly try to climb the pinnacle of riches. And here just one or two examples, something that will be familiar to everyone here, the destructive role of ambition. One or two examples to demonstrate their psychological approach, these two writers, in contrast to the moralism of classical writers like Cicero and Renaissance humanists. Also contrasting with classical and Renaissance moralists is Lucretius and Machiavelli's respect for animals as models of behavior, which transgresses a classical and Christian taboo in narrowing the gap between animals and humans. According to Lucretius, animals survive because of their fitness or utility to man. Not exactly Darwinian evolution, since the species remain separate. But as we've already seen and already know, the lion and fox offer models to Machiavelli, as well as to Lucretius, of good genes to be preserved and valued. What a contrast to Cicero's reference to the lion's strength and the fox's cunning being bestial and wholly unworthy of men. In his autographical poem, The Golden Ass, L'asino d'oro, Machiavelli also follows Lucretius's description of man's weakness compared with animals in being born a naked, wailing child. It's in this poem, I think, that Machiavelli is closest to Lucretius's moral stance, in viewing man from a distance, safely from the shore, as it were, or in the poem, from the viewpoint of the boar transformed by Circe into an animal and unwilling to return to human status. From this point of view, animals are not only stronger than men, they are also braver, more prudent, and more temperate in not overeating and not being over-energetic lovers. They entirely lack man's ruinous ambition, as we've seen, and they are also more independent, more self-motivated than men. Rising to his feet, levosi allora in piedi, the boar declares, "I don't want to live with you, and I refuse. Non voglio e rifiuto." Here, I hope you appreciate the porcellino. He's not quite on his hind legs, but I like to think he's on his way there. And so we come full circle, back to the importance of free will through the swerve of atoms in Machiavelli's philosophy, which is as important in political writings like The Prince as it is in his autobiographical poem, The Golden Ass. Here I quote from the ever more famous chapter 25 in The Prince on fortune, that although fortune controls half our lives, in order to preserve our free will, we are able to control more or less the other half. And so in chapter 26, he appeals to the Medici as princes to seize the initiative in the crisis and do the rest, since God doesn't want to do everything. And instead of Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, to whom the prince was addressed, I think not a very pleasant character, I have to say, around 1515, I show you the more heroic figure of Giovanni delle Bande Nere, whom Machiavelli hoped would save Florence from the German invaders in 1526, since Giovanni was brave and impetuous, has great ideas, and is a taker of bold decisions. The perfect example, it seems to me, of a man clever and virile enough to defy fortune and the stars by changing his step this way and that. Despite the importance of a single leader in a crisis, the best life for Machiavelli was one, surely, of political and economic freedom in a republic, as he describes it in Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 2, which in turn follows very closely Epicurus' 14th maxim, defining the material conditions for freedom. That is, being, quoting, tolerably secure from our fellow citizens and powerful enough to be materially prosperous. Being secure and free enough to pursue our desires is what Machiavelli translates in Discourses 2:2 as being able to marry freely, have children, own property, and be in competition with each other, following both their own private interest and the public interest. And since he'd said in an earlier chapter that apart from the 40 to 50 people capable of holding power in the Republic, all the rest simply want to live securely, his argument accords quite well with Epicurus's. It also tallies with the view ascribed to Niccolò in Luigi Guicciardini's draft dialogue on man's free will. In it, instead of agreeing with Girolamo, possibly Luigi's brother, I think the other characters haven't been identified fully. So Girolamo argues that men devote their lives to promote virtue and especially poverty. In contrast to that, Niccolò, the character Niccolò, argues that instead that since men strive all their lives to escape poverty and enjoy leisure, nature would have been too harmful to humans to have given them appetites so contrary to their health. So here Luigi Guicciardini, a friend, of course, to whom Machiavelli dedicated the poem on his poem on ambition, and also the man whose son, also a Niccolò, had quoted the prince to him in 1516, recommending Machiavelli's advice. So, in other words, Luigi would know Machiavelli well, very familiar to him, but Machiavelli had died before he wrote this draft dialogue. Anyway, in it he very evocatively describes Machiavelli's naturalism, both emphasizing the importance to him of our appetites and passions, and combining this with his view of economic man, restless and acquisitive, valuing his possessions before his family. There's one aspect of Epicureanism that I haven't mentioned, and which for most people typifies this philosophy, and that is pleasure and happiness. So it seems a suitably happy note on which to end. After publishing my book, I realized that Lucretius was still flowing through Machiavelli's veins when he composed the canzone Si suave è l'inganno, How Sweet is Deception, in 1525 to 26, just a year or two before he died. It was one of the several songs added to the interludes between the acts of his play La Mandragola and La Clizia for his beloved mistress, Barbara Salviati Rafacani, to sing. Fittingly, the song reflects the theme of love in the opening lines of De Rerum Natura by praising you, O love, who by making others happy with your great power also make them blessed. But it also plays on two other well-known passages from Lucretius. One is the equally famous opening lines of Book 2, quoted by Proust, as well as Machiavelli and others, on Schadenfreude. Suave mare magno. How sweet it is when the sea is rough to watch another's tribulations from the shore. The other is Lucretius's praise of Epicurus in Book 6, lines 27-28, as the man who showed us the straight and narrow path to which we should run without turning. And here I hope you can see from what I've written up there the words which I think show, Lucretius is very much in his mind when he wrote them. The play may or may not represent the ruse of young reformers to woo Florence from control by the old oligarchy, as Ronald Martinez suggests. But what is clear, I think, is that its transgressive themes of adultery and deception are translated by the canzone into the Lucretian narrative that I've been pursuing today. That is, a young man's ability to change step or innovate by using his free will, as well as his animal instincts of guile and craft, in order to overcome outdated superstition, which in Machiavelli's case, in Lucretius's case, of course, is religion. The apparent relativism of Machiavelli's naturalistic morality has given rise to his posthumous reputation for immorality and wickedness. But if we assess him by looking backwards to his Epicurean roots, which judged good and evil by sober reasoning, measuring one against the other, and by looking at the conveniences and inconveniences, as Epicurus writes, we find this is exactly what Machiavelli does in judging the consequences or the results in human affairs and politics, which are not subject to higher a priori laws. And if we look forward, we find that Thomas Hobbes, too, shares the same approach in judging what is good and evil, in measuring their advantages and disadvantages, or what he calls reckoning, that is, adding and subtracting the consequences. Accordingly, Hobbes's first precept, or general rule of reason, is that every man ought to endeavour peace, and his second law of nature is identical to Machiavelli's and Epicurus's natural law of expedient self-interest. Do unto others what they should do unto you. Well, here I think I have to stop. By following the trail of what Gérard Passanant has aptly called the absent presence of Lucretius in Renaissance writings, like Machiavelli's, and since, as we all know, I think I said at the beginning, Machiavelli never mentions Lucretius's name or openly quotes him in anything he wrote, it's only entirely to the discovery of his manuscript that we know how much he'd absorbed from transcribing him. So despite this, we can nevertheless see how much he owes to Epicurean psychology and naturalism, which run like explanatory threads through nearly all his writings, giving them coherence and explaining their novelty. As transgressive as Lucretius was in breaking taboos by his naturalism, Machiavelli was equally forward-looking in grasping man's psychology and basing his expedient morality and politics on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. I'm here. Carlo Pinchin reviewing the translation of Roberto Ridolfi's book, but very clear statement on the importance, the major discovery of the century, in a sense, was Machiavelli's manuscript on Lucretius, referring to what did...
Sorry, can you speak louder?
Well, so I was saying that Carlo Pinchin, mentioned before by Fabio, criticizing Roberto Ridolfi's attitude towards Bertolli's discovery. Ridolfi pretending that Lucretius, the only importance of Lucretius for Machiavelli was a matter of style in the quality of the writing, but nothing in terms of substance. Said that this was a major discovery of scholarship, the De Naturarum of Lucretius. An important moment in Bertolli's article was concerning the possibilities that Machiavelli was working to a kind of new edition of Lucretius De Natura Rerum. So the problem is also how Machiavelli did establish the text, what were the manuscript and editions he was using, what was the project behind, and a work on that, a critical edition of Machiavelli's, a critical edition of Machiavelli's manuscript of the De Natura Rerum would have been a major advancement in the Nazionale Edizione Nazionale delle Opere di Machiavelli, which was not even considered, I think, in this project. And I think it would be extremely important to, because you did this work on the margins, which is extremely important. And another step would be to clarify this point made by Bertolli about the specificity of the establishment of the text by Machiavelli. Would you consider to do a kind of critical edition like that of Machiavelli's De Natura Rerum?
Yes, I mean, I speculated myself that that's what he might have been doing with Adriani, because, you know, in the Laurentiana 35-31 was the copy that Adriani makes his comments in the margins, and Machiavelli adopts them all in his transcription, but they stop just before the end of Book 1. So one then gets the feeling that Machiavelli is going on. I mean, they are his own comments in Book 2, and as I say, or he copies later comments that are in all the editions, but these seem to be unique to Machiavelli. And so I myself speculated that he was planning to do a Florentine edition because the Giunti, you know, the Venetian edition had just come out in 95, and it would have seemed, you know, the Florentines really wanted to be in on the act, and Adriani was very interested in the text. And that makes the most sense of why Machiavelli was transcribing it. Otherwise, it seems, unless it was done for his university lectures, it seems a long labour for that. The other reason why I think it might be feasible is that I've tried as far as possible to discover which text he was using. I haven't found a precise one that he copied. But what is very interesting is that he copied all Marollo's comments, which were the latest. For a Florentine edition, they would be really important. There's a particularly important edition. It's the Venice 1495 edition, now in Paris, which belonged to the Martelli, and it has all the three main. It has Pompono Leto, it has Pontano, and it has Marollo's comments in the margins. And Machiavelli has used upon Marollo's first and second emendations, but not the very latest ones. And if one wants to make sense of it, one would say that he got his job in the Chancery and just gave up at that point. Adriani was also in the Chancery, and he was still teaching, but he wouldn't have had time to do an edition. And so that may be the reason why it never went ahead. They may have given up. When Michael Reeve was writing his report of all these books, he said simply that Machiavelli copied the printed edition, and that was all. And that's not true. It's much more complicated than that, which might make sense of it. So, yes, it's up for grabs. Anyone who likes to find out who wrote Machiavelli's edition, it would be very interesting to find out. But he was clearly using quite a lot of different editions, which does suggest a sort of an element of seriousness about it.
Yes, very short. Just a naive question. I'm completely convinced about what you say of Machiavelli following Epicurus in his physics. Yeah. What has always struck me is why he seems to be very not following Epicurus when it comes to politics. Yes, and I was wondering what your idea is. That is, in comparison with Plato and Aristotle, and also the Stoics, Epicurus is definitely the most quietistic and less political of all the works. So I'm just wondering about that.
Yes.
What do you make of it?
Yes, I mean, I do agree. I mean, that's where they differ most. They didn't retreat from politics, except that Machiavelli really did at the end of his life. I mean, not totally. He was always game to, if offered the chance, he would come back. But it seems to me his writing of plays, his going to the gardens of the Orti Oricellari was a very Epicurean thing to do, to be going to the gardens and talking about ideas. It's there, I think, that he got his interest in the language, where all the language debates were taking place, although we're mainly told that was where he was writing the discourses and so on. And it was, I think... I always sort of think that writing plays is like looking on life from afar. It's sort of an image given by Lucretius that you should not get involved in politics, but you should comment on them from the outside. I don't know what John thinks about this, but, playwriting and following the love of his mistress and so on might be a form of following Lucretius in his garden activities. But I do agree that, it wasn't part of his philosophy to opt out of politics, but it was more forced on him, perhaps.
Okay. We haven't got time for any more questions. I know there are a couple, but if you could take them off over to that would be great. Should we say thank you to Alison once more?